All right, I'm here with Norm Smith here in Norm's home in Albion, Nebraska today on October 18th, 2010. Norm was born in 1925 and served in the Army as part of Company C of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment in the 101st Airborne Division during World War II in the European theater. His highest rank achieved was corporal. Okay, first, could you give us details about your life up until you entered the service?
Very briefly, I was born in Ames, Iowa, and left there in a shoebox. So we moved from Ames, Iowa to Bowling Green, Kentucky. Bowling Green, Kentucky, we went to Canada, to Medicine Hat, Alberta, and from Medicine Hat, Alberta, we moved to Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and from Saskatchewan we came back to North Dakota. From North Dakota we moved to Idaho, and from Idaho we moved to Seattle, Washington, and by that time I was in the 5th grade, and we lived in Seattle until I was drafted at the age of 18, and that was in 1943. People often ask me, oh, what did your father do? Was he a salesman? No, he was not a salesman. He learned as a young man how to operate one of the first newspaper presses that operated from a continuous roll of paper as opposed to a single sheet being put in there. And he was a web pressman. It was a very difficult job. You would hear a lot of swearing in the press room when the web broke, because the web had to be threaded in and around the rollers that picked up the ink, and it went through and made the machine printed. But in the end product is you actually had a newspaper that already folded that came out of the end of the press. You could pick it up and unfold it and read it. That was quite a wonderful invention of its day. It was called a duplex. And my father became very proficient with that press. I found out in talking with the editor of the Albion News, the former editor, it was Jack Lowe, and he told me that they once had a duplex here. Almost every town of any size had a duplex. And what was also wonderful about it is that for the first time they were able to print with more than one color. So you had not just black and white, but you could have some of the ads, and especially where you're advertising vegetables for the grocer, you had red apples actually in there, and you had yellow bananas, and that was a big thing. So that's basically what the reason we moved so much. Duplex pressman would come to town, and my dad would get to know him, and then he would always say, "Hey, I know where there's a better town and more money." So we hopped and skipped all over.
All right. Well, can you tell me when you were drafted?
Well, let me go back to the beginning. Do you understand what the word selective service means?
Yeah.
Okay. In 1940, there was a general act passed which required all males 18 who became 18, you had to register for the draft. And you went to the post office to do that. And that put your name into a pool of individuals. every community the size of Albion, and it might have been smaller, I guess, would have a draft board, a group of people that had to pick from these names, and they had a quota. So once a month, they were told, well, we need 40 applicants or X number of applicants, and that board had to sit down and decide, okay, who do we get? Do we take Kevin Carter? He might. And they tried to select healthy specimens. You went through a process of going before that board. Once they had selected you, then you received a letter. You have been selected by a board of your friends and neighbors, they called them, to be a part of the Universal Draft Act. So that was the first step. The second step was another meeting that you would go to and appear before the board. Now, the draft board in Albion, for your information, was the upstairs over the boot rack. That was the draft board up in there, and if you had an occasion to go up there, you probably still find some of the doors lettered with that information. So, after having the second meeting, the second meeting would usually have at least one doctor there. So as you were looked over, and this is just like the sale barn, you see, you're going through there, and you know, this guy looks good, that guy, he's fine, okay. Oh boy, this fellow here, he's crippled, well, we won't take him. And the result is they're looking for a perfect specimen. And if you had any defects, such as, and we'll say that you had an accident, you'd lost sight in one eye, that would automatically classify you differently. Each of us carried a card, and that card on there says that you have been selected, and your classification is, if you were number one, good shape and so forth, you became 1A. That meant that you were draftable right then and there. If I were in the condition I am today, they would look at me and they'd say, you are 4F, meaning that I am disabled, I'm not fit for service. But nevertheless, I would have to carry that card. It's very important to it. You would be identified then wherever you went if you were challenged. All right, about the third meeting is where they would say ahead of time, when you come to this meeting, this will be our final look at you. And in Seattle, it was held in a skyscraper, what was then a skyscraper downtown. Northern Life Tower it was called. And I went in there and there would be about 100 guys. And they each had each draft board knew that they had to get so many people in. And as a result, then it was constantly selecting and getting them put together. So finally they've got a basic group together. And usually, in Seattle, they would get a train load. I couldn't tell you how many cars in that train, but they had a quantity they had to get. You went in there and you were given a box here, and you're going to leave all and take all your clothes. Because when you get to the training depot, the beginning point in the process, which was a nearby fort called Fort Lewis, that's where you had to surrender your clothes, put them in a box, and mail them home. And then you were given all Army clothes. So that's the beginning of the training process. Then we got on a train and we went from there to the basic infantry training camp, which was Camp Roberts, California, which incidentally at that time was the largest training camp in the country. And you were then divided into training battalions. So your new address, in my case, would be the 81st Infantry Training Battalion. And we're all going to train together, and that's about 1,000 men. So, required of you then was a regular schedule of all of the things that they wanted you to do. Mainly learn left from right, so you could march. You had to learn the rules of the Army. You were quickly told that one of the things is, and if you're on guard in the Army and you fall asleep, you're liable to be shot. And they were right blunt about it. What happens if I don't like it and I run away? We come and get you and we put you back, we put you in jail. So very, very strict rules. You understood that this was not a play game. The next thing you learned is that they had lots of square needles. And I mean, everybody had to have a shot, a whole series of shots, tetanus, typhoid. One of the things they were concerned about was I'll think of it here in a moment. It's like polio, spinal meningitis. They were looking for that. So they looked for all of the defects, and they had to have a healthy army, because where they sent you then, especially to the South Pacific, was tremendous. If you didn't have malaria shots and you went there, you'd have malaria as soon as you got off the boat almost. So all of the shots that you had to take, and also then you're in barracks together, and you stay together as an infantry training battalion until you finish your training. The training was 17 weeks at that time. Now, it started out with 8 weeks, and then they increased it from 8 to 13, and the next one was 13 to 17. All right, I was drafted in October of '43, and I went through my basic training and so forth, and I got out in the spring of 1944. That's when I finished that 17-week period. They put you under many different exercises that were realistic. For example, and they would refer to them as a training course. Well, first of all, they teach you how to fire a rifle. And that was one of the first humorous things that I ever saw, was that there'd always be somebody in there who said, well, I went squirrel hunting as a kid, you know, I don't need to learn how to fire a rifle. And they quickly said, there's your way, there's our way, and there's the Army way. You're going to learn the Army way. So you mean I can't use my shooting jacket? No, you send your shooting jacket home. You will use the equipment we give you to work with. All of the equipment we trained with to begin with was from World War I, 1918. That's how old it was. We wore a different style helmet than it ultimately ended up with. We had leggings that had to be buttoned up the side, and the clothes that we wore for regular work detail were called fatigues. And this is basically what you had as far as training was concerned. You had a regular dress uniform. It was called a Class A uniform. That had the brass buttons. That's in that picture I'm over there, and you have on the table there. Why? That was the Class A uniform. So, all the way through physical training, usually every day at least 3 or 4 hours devoted to physical training. You marched everywhere you went. When you weren't marching, you were double timing, you were running. And the object was to get you into physical shape. Well, the average American was in lousy shape. Nutritionally, they were in poor shape. This is where the standards for a loaf of bread, today you pick up a loaf of bread and it tells you right on it, this has been enriched, and they tell you all of the vitamins and everything put in it. That all happened at the beginning of the war. So there, many guys were declared 4F or weeded out as they went along. If you wouldn't make an infantryman, then, well, maybe we can make a cook or a baker out of you, or maybe we can make a grease monkey out of you, different jobs, and so you went along hoping, well, gee, I don't like this idea of marching all around, I don't like this idea of sleeping in the mud, I don't like to be out in the rain. Well, things like that go through a graduation process. You learn to go out and camp in the mud. The final 2 weeks were spent away from the camp, and they took you marched 25 miles from the camp to a training ground, and there you, no matter what the weather was, you took out your shelter half. You and I would have to be buddies if we were together. You'd have a shelter half, I'd have the other half of the tent. We'd have to get together and button it up. And you'd have 2 poles, and you'd have a pole and I'd have a pole, so now we've got a pole for each end of the tent. And you would have a tent rope and I would have a tent rope. So you had to become a buddy to have a complete tent. So the idea then is to not be necessarily nice to you, but rather get you out, because that's infantry. What do? In the infantry, you march, you march, you march. And you had to learn to get your tent all together in a hurry, because sometimes you had to move out of an encampment in a big hurry. Another one of the training portions was to get you accustomed not only to the firing of the weapon, to then have you accustomed to what bullets sound like going over your head. So they would have you on a course whereby you started the course, you went under barbed wire that was about as high as this table. They had machine guns behind you, and they were firing live ammunition, just spraying it all over, and they were saying one thing: don't stand up. And you crawled on your belly, and you crawled under barbed wire entanglements. You learned how to go over barbed wire. Then they had convenient places where they had charges hidden. About the time you were crawling along there with your rifle and you're going under the barbed wire, then it whoom, and they blew the charges up and mud went all over the place, and you come down and say, he got me muddy, oh boy. So you go through this, and at the end you had 2 live hand grenades with you, and you pretended that you were attacking a position, so you got up and ran about 25 yards, and then you pulled the pin and you threw the grenade as far as you could throw it. Well, you have 5 seconds from the time you pull the pin until that grenade explodes. So boy, you really learn how to throw the thing, get it out of there. Realistic training exercises. You learn to fire a machine gun. You learn to fire a heavier rifle. It was called a Browning automatic rifle. These are all World War I weapons now. And you learned then how to fire a mortar, 60 millimeter mortar. You learned how to fire a bazooka. Now, bazooka goes back to the days of the little Abner. And the idea, anyway, that along looked like a rocket. You see, it looked very much like the terrorists you see today. It was an anti-tank weapon, so you learned to fire that. You had to be able to fire any of the basic weapons of the infantry was the best way to put it.
Okay.
So once you've done that, your final finale then is you make the 25-mile march back into camp, and you have full field equipment. You've got to do that march in less than 8 hours. So you're a bit tuckered when you get back to the. So that was it. So contrary to what you hear today, we say, oh, we have an all-volunteer army. Well, or service. Yes and no. I didn't volunteer to be drafted. But from then on, if you wanted to change and do anything else, you had to volunteer for it. So that's how I got into the paratroops. They came along recruiting right after D-Day. That was June 6th, 1944. They dropped 13,000 paratroopers into Europe, and they lost 6,000 dead in the invasion of Normandy. So there was a shortage in the paratroop outfits. You could volunteer for that. You could volunteer for officer school. You had to have what we called an Army entrance type test. I've forgotten what they call it. Anyway, it was a general intelligence test. You had to score at least 100 on that in order to get to officer school. Or you could go into the paratroops, and that was all volunteer. You could become a pilot. That was all volunteer. No one was forced into those things. Basically, they always had plenty of people who volunteered for them. And all branches of the service at that time took a look at you before you went in. So your final screening, when you had your papers and you're ready to go, where am I going? You got the Army here, and you got the Navy here, and you got the Coast Guard here, and you got the Marines here, and so forth. Well, they all had a representative sitting there, look at your paper, and they pass it on to the next one. So when they got my paper, I said, well, I hope the guy just throws it in the garbage, but he didn't do that. So that was the selective process. That's the way you were qualified. A lot of men fell out because they couldn't physically stand the training. Where physically the people were in very poor shape, and it alarmed the government how many people they were that way. If you were involved then at that time, a farmer had a good chance of staying out, although it's not necessarily true. Plenty of fellows who were drafted from Boone County. But you were considered essential to the war effort. So if you could produce food and so forth, why, that's the way it went.
Well, so can you tell us what it was like to be shipped over to Europe and over there?
You were shipped over to Europe as a replacement, meaning the casualties were so heavy in the infantry that you would go into, say, a company of men, 120 men or so, and if they all were wiped out or went into the hospital or injured and so forth, you'd have to replace all those men. So I would be called a replacement. And so I was trained as a paratrooper. That took a month of training, and you had to learn how to pack your own chute. You had to learn then how to jump your own chute, because you couldn't blame somebody else who didn't pack this right. I didn't. And you made 5 jumps to qualify, and after the 5 jumps, 4 of those jumps were daytime and 1 night jump. And you learned to jump with equipment, about 100 pounds of equipment, including your weight. And then you were given a temporary assignment. That is, you got a temporary unit assignment as you go overseas. So you go overseas. It was a mixed bag. I went overseas on the Queen Elizabeth, and the Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Mary were twin ships. 15,000 troops they carried. That's a lot of people. So you might, if you were lucky, get into a stateroom that was designed for 2 people, and there'd be 20 of you in there. They just hung bunks all over the wall that flopped down. All the swimming pools were filled with troops, so that there was no, you couldn't even tell you were in what had been a swimming pool. The dining area, they fed 1,500 men at a time. You couldn't, and 15,000 people, you could not get time to feed 2 meals a day, or 3 meals a day. So there was just 2 meals a day, and you ate that, plus there was always junk food circulating around. Some guy brought in, got candy bars and things like that. But that was the general idea as far as going overseas. To go from New York to Glasgow, Scotland, took us about 6 days. The Queen's, both of the ships, the Queen Mary, the Queen Elizabeth, were very fast. They could go up to 30 miles an hour, which is very fast for a big ship. And as a result, when you were in submarine waters, every 5 minutes they changed direction. So you'd have to sense that. Boy, and when they changed direction, I mean, you'd better be sitting down and holding on to something, because it was very tough that way. I volunteered for KP. Dumb thing. No one ever volunteered, but that was the best thing. I had some latitude. I could go around the ship because I had a special uniform on that allowed me to go different places. And then when I waited on table, we'd need bread in one side, and this is where your football skills come in. I need bread. You'd hold up a pan like that, and the guy over there going, pew! A loaf of bread. As long as you got in the pan, fine. If you missed and hit a guy in the head, he's very annoyed with you. So, anyway.
Well, can you talk about being over and your duties in Europe?
Well, you get into the reality of it when you first time you get off the ship, and suddenly you realize you're places where the Germans had bombed. You get into a city and the buildings that were completely destroyed. That reality comes very fast. We landed in Glasgow, Scotland, went directly down to Southampton, England. And we were getting ready to go on the ship there, and all of a sudden, there were 40 of us held back. They had a case of measles broke out, so they quarantined 40 of us. And they put us in the town square behind barbed wire. We weren't supposed to go out, and nobody else was supposed to go in. You took off your identification like that, and you went between the wires, and you went all over town. I mean, but that's not here to say. They were, at that time, though, the bombing of England was over, and the only thing left to be concerned about were flying rockets, a V-2 rocket. And I heard a couple of those go over, but other than that, I had no problem. Finally, after 10 days, when I went down and got on board a Polish vessel and went across the channel to land in France. And we landed at Le Havre, France, and at night, you go to the side of the ship, climb down cargo nets, get into the landing craft and go ashore. And then from then on, it was a matter of riding trains, boxcars. 40 and 8 they were called, 40 men and 8 horses, or 8 horses. The train took you as close to the front as they could get at that time. So I ended up in Liège, Belgium was about the closest to the actual front that I got at that time. And when you get up in front, then they're always moving troops back and forth and move you out of one sector and send you to another. Well, they sent me back to the 101st, and there were about 40 of us that were distributed. They went right through the division, down the division street there, and they'd say, okay, the C Company's over here, and you go to C Company. And so that gets to the replacement portion of it. So I did not see any actual front line fighting until the 1st of April. And at that time, we were moved into what they referred to as the Ruhr Pocket. And this is along the Rhine River, and we were in foxholes alongside. Right across from us was the city of Dusseldorf, Duisburg, Krefeld, Aachen, and it was just rubble all over the place. And at that particular time, you know what I'm talking about the Ruhr Pocket. We invaded, we went across the Rhine. This is when Patton made quite a name for himself when he said, well, he wasn't going to wait for them to decide to invite him. He just took his boys, he says, we're going across here. They went across at Remagen, and they just kept going, right on going, and he outran his own supplies. And the Germans were just stunned by that kind of a thing. They just kept going. So he surrounded the big pocket, and then until that pocket surrendered, why we were engaged in one side of it, along the Rhine River. From there, the next move was to go into southern Germany, and the Germans were retreating as fast as they could. They wanted to get out of the way. And this is where I've described the going into Landsberg. Didn't realize the reality of being in combat until you feel a bump on the truck and you look down and you've just run over a body. And where the human head has been flattened out as big as this table. I mean, those kinds of things. You don't know what's going on because you are not in the front of it. You're in the tail end of it until the column stops. You don't know why they stopped. You can hear the firing, you can see the smoke, and then they move up maybe 20 to 50 feet, maybe 100 feet at a time. You say, here we go again, and then halt again. But you see the evidence alongside both sides of the road because there are flaming vehicles there, the dead bodies in the vehicles. And so the tanks have been countered and knocked the enemy out of position. The Germans just wanted to get out of there as fast as they could, and that was one of the things that made coming upon a concentration camp absolutely stunning. We got into some smoke and came over the highway just like a prairie fire around here. Got into that smoke, pungent. The guys started getting sick and vomiting from it. We didn't have gas mask or anything like that. Well, Then the word came down the line. He says, "My God, there's a house up here." He says, "They've put people in there. They've got every exit blocked. They poured gasoline on it. They set it afire. They were burning people alive. They're trying to cover up what they knew was there, and of course, there's no way you could cover it up. I mean, you're not talking about a few people. You're talking about people that have been caged, slave laborers, and that was basically how we first saw in Landsberg. We were sent out to clear out the woods, and every bit of the woods in that area had been reforested. The Germans were very methodical. Trees were in perfect line. These were all coniferous trees. A bed of needles, 10, 12 inches deep, very soft and nice to walk on, except you had to be careful where you walked, because the gates of the camp had been opened. Most of the people were still standing inside the gate. They were afraid to come out. And the ones that were strong enough to do it, they did make their way out. But they had dysentery and diarrhea so bad that you just pools and pools and pools of it. You had to, just like walking through I'd say a slaughter, well, our confinement here with cattle, basically. So, we went into town that night. We took over a building downtown and occupied it. We came back out the next morning, and then they said, "We're going to go around the camp and look for stray soldiers, German soldiers, and anyone back in the woods there." So part of this whole experience was to walk along, and you'd look up and you'd see a body lying, obviously a body. Every one of them, they had, this is in May, it was still cold, and they put shredded garments and whatnot they put over their head like that, and they just found a dignified place to die under a tree, and that's really what it fallen under. I took the muzzle of my rifle and just reached down and lifted off the garment to make sure that whether the person was dead or alive, and every single one I found were just dead bodies. And that's as far away from the camp as they had the strength to go. And, they were working 12-hour days. We looked for people who could speak English, and we found a banker one day that had been in prison for 8 years. He was an Austrian. He demonstrated by taking his fingers like this, put it into his crotch, and he had space to go around. He was that thin. Probably weighed maybe, I'd say, somewhere between 60, 70, 80 pounds. 12 hours a day on a liter of soup, so-called, made out of carrot peelings, potato peelings, some kind of meat. They never knew what kind of meat was thrown in there, and onions, and that, and 4 ounces of bread, and that was basically what they were supposed to survive on. Literally, factually starved to death. So we made the mistake of trying to feed them. Come on, we've got lots of chow and so forth. They take 1 teaspoon or a tablespoon of food and they begin to vomit immediately. They were so dehydrated. The medics didn't know what to do, and they were just at their wits' end, because you could see people were dying all around, but they had nothing. We really weren't equipped for it. So basically, that was the one camp that I saw. But if you've seen one, you've seen them all. Today, some of those, I don't know. Did you go to Buchenwald?
We went to Dachau.
I went to Dachau. This was a sub-camp of Dachau. We were immediately south of there. And so then I don't need to tell you about the ovens. There's still reason. The people that had to do the dirty work were not the Germans. They were the captured, displaced persons, they were called, or the undesirables. So they're the ones that got to clean out the ashes and spread the ashes out on the gardens and that kind of thing. And that condition was common. That was one common way, if nothing else. Clean up the area, and you take the bodies and you try to burn them. And all I can say is the Germans were doing everything they could to get out of the way, and they were surrendering by thousands by that time. And we just have a lot of the pictures that I brought back are just, it's over, thank God. They ended up fighting the war with old men and young boys. That's all they had left. And lucky was the German that was captured in Africa and sent to Nebraska to work on a farm. So.
I also understand you saw Hitler's home, the Berghof.
That was the final objective. We didn't know it at the time, but Hitler had an exclusive part of Austria set aside. It's called the Obersalzberg, and we went in on May 5th when we marched in there. There was no resistance. We just plain marched into the town, and we stayed in fancy apartments that were built for the SS. And they had apartments that were built right into the side of the valley. And nice furniture. We got sheets, we got beds, we got pillows. And we came in on I don't know, Wednesday evening, I guess it was. The next morning, we could see, about 10 miles away, we could see where Hitler's home was. And a French armored column came in during the night. And they went right up to and in the Berghof, and they were busy looting. They found a big wine cellar up there, and lots of stories that Hitler didn't drink, but he sure had an awful lot of liquor around there. So they were loading up every bottle of everything they could find, and they were coming down the hillside. And my company, or platoon, was set up there to take over from the French. So when we did, then we also were occupying the Berghof, which is the burned out remains of Hitler's home. And in those days, you could send home legal souvenirs. If it had the Nazi swastika on it, it was a legal thing you could send home. You took the item to an officer, you put it in a box, you listed what you had, he took a look, you say, okay, you've got one picture of Hitler, all right, fine. One pistol, that's all you could send home. Seems funny the way I see like every grade school kid could get a pistol in this country now, I think, if they wanted to. We couldn't send home anything but a regular type pistol. I sent home a Luger. I sent home an Army rifle. You could not send home any automatic weapon. No submachine guns or anything like that. No, that was, as they say, verboten. So he packed it in a box, and all of the ships coming from the United States were then trying to rebuild Europe, so ships were full going coming over, and what they brought back then were the boxes of we'll call ourselves looters. It was looting. Parts of the uniforms, all the collection that I once had was all sent home. And once it was inspected, they marked postage was free, and they sent it home. So the pictures that I sent home, a lot of them I picked up after the war was over. I didn't have a camera at the time, so that made it very tough to actually go along and document anything. I couldn't go there as a tourist, you might say. It was a matter of a point system, and you received 1 point for every month you'd spent in the Army. You received 2 points for every month that you'd spent overseas. And you received 5 points if you were wounded. And if you were wounded several times, well, that was for each one of the wounds. This way, the guy that got over there at the beginning of the war and went through it was not necessarily wounded, but he might have been over there 40, 50 months. As opposed to my case, I was over there I was in the Army 26 months, but I was only 12 months overseas. So using the point system, I had 35 points. I was a low point man. It's not right that I should be coming home ahead of a guy that's been in the Army for 5 years. So what brought me home early, though, was the fact that I could play clarinet, and they wanted to have a 100-piece marching band for a big parade in New York City. So as a result of that, I was transferred into a band, and that was soft duty compared to all the other stuff. So I came home with the 82nd Airborne. The 101st was supposed to come home and make this New York Victory Parade, and instead I came home with the 82nd, so they got the honor, and then we have a 3-hour and 40-minute parade, and once we're through that, why, you guys can go home now, we're through here with you. So having an advantage of, again, being able to volunteer into something because you had a skill. I often said my mother had a good hold on me practicing right here. You get in there and practice.
All right. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about? Or?
Well, I'm myself, I am pleased that there's an attempt of the younger generation to get out and talk to people, find out firsthand. There's an awful lot of baloney out there. There's a tremendous number of World War II books. Some of them are not worth the pages they're written on. And I'm a very, very critical of Band of Brothers, because that was written by a prominent writer, Stephen Ambrose, but Ambrose died halfway through the miniseries they made, so then they wondered, how do we finish it up? So they just took history and turned it around. They had Company E liberating Landsberg. They did not. They had Company E going to the Hitler's Nest. They did not. But you don't know anything. Hollywood can take anything and make it entertaining. So at the end of the Band of Brothers are going into this concentration camp, which they did not do, but they went into the city. It was my company, Company C, went into the city and rounded up people from the city of Landsberg by rifle point and brought them out and said, look at this. Oh, nobody knew the camp was out there. First they knew about it. We had them pick up the bodies and throw them in the pit to bury them. The only way you could handle the situation was get a big bulldozer. You had a cattle ranch out here and you suddenly lost 50 or 60 cattle at one time, you'd probably do the same thing. You'd say, what am I going to do with them? I can't get him to the rendering. Bury him. So it's very, very, very tough. People want to argue there was no Holocaust. They want to argue they didn't kill 6 million. They only killed 1.5 million. Big deal. It doesn't make any difference how many people they killed. There's so many survivors, and that's the function right now. I've spoken about the Holocaust, what little I saw of it. I probably started in 1946, right after I got out. And it's to get people to understand that it's sad, in my opinion, to see some of these idiots running around who are still putting swastika signs on a synagogue. And still using bigotry and the development of hate. I can't understand that. You're the only hope that you become well educated. If you're interested in the subject, there's unlimited amount of information available.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your service to our country. Thank you for letting me interview.
Thank you for coming.